When the fraud moves from the street corner to the boardroom, the damage isn't measured in millions. It's measured in shattered systems. There's a difference between a man who lies and a company that lies. When a man lies, he destroys individuals. When a company lies, it destroys faith. Faith in markets, faith in regulators, faith in the idea that someone, somewhere, is making sure the game isn't rigged. Day one was about believers, people who handed their money to charismatic con artists and hoped for magic. But what happens when the con artist isn't a person? What happens when it's a corporation with a legal department, an accounting firm, and a stock price that analysts worship like scripture? What happens when the fraud is so big, so complex, so woven into the machinery of American capitalism that by the time anyone notices, it's already too late? 3 companies, 3 catastrophic lies, and 3 million people who learned that institutions don't protect you. Sometimes they're what you need protection from. Mississippi, 1983. A man named Bernard Ebbers bought a small, long-distance telephone company with money borrowed from friends and family. He had no technology background, no telecommunications experience. What he had was ambition and a willingness to do whatever it took to appear successful. The company was called LDDS, Long Distance Discount Services. In the beginning, it was exactly what it claimed to be, a budget alternative to AT&T's monopoly on long-distance calls. But Ebbers wasn't interested in building slowly. He wanted scale, empire, market dominance. So he started acquiring competitors, dozens of them. By the mid-90s, LDDS had swallowed 65 companies and changed its name to WorldCom. Wall Street loved the story. Ebbers was selling the dream of telecommunications disruption before anyone used the word disruption. He promised investors that WorldCom would dominate the future of communication. The stock price soared. Ebbers became a billionaire on paper. Analysts called him a visionary. But beneath the acquisition spree and the soaring stock price was a problem. WorldCom wasn't actually making money. The acquisitions were expensive. The debt was crushing. And in the competitive wasteland of 90s telecom, profit margins were razor thin. Ebbers needed WorldCom to look profitable whether it was or not. So he and his chief financial officer, Scott Sullivan, started cooking the books. The fraud was brutally simple. Companies have 2 kinds of expenses: operating expenses and capital expenditures. Operating expenses are day-to-day costs, salaries, rent, supplies. They hit your profit immediately. Capital expenditures are long-term investments, equipment, infrastructure. You can spread those costs over years. WorldCom took billions of dollars in operating expenses and reclassified them as capital expenditures. On paper, this made the company look wildly profitable. Revenue stayed the same, but expenses vanished from the quarterly reports. Analysts saw steady growth. Investors saw rising profits. And Bernie Ebbers kept borrowing more money against his WorldCom stock to fund his personal empire of ranches, yachts, and timber companies. The scheme worked for years. WorldCom grew to become the 2nd largest long-distance carrier in America. At its peak, the company was worth over $100 billion. Pension funds held the stock. Mutual funds recommended it. Employees built their retirement plans around it. WorldCom wasn't just a company, it was woven into the portfolios of millions of Americans who had no idea they were invested in accounting fiction. The collapse started with a woman named Cynthia Cooper. She was WorldCom's vice president of internal audit, essentially the company's internal detective. In early 2002, she started noticing irregularities, expenses that didn't make sense, transfers between accounts that seemed designed to hide something. She dug deeper, working late nights, keeping her investigation secret even from her bosses because she suspected the fraud went all the way to the top. She was right. Cooper discovered that WorldCom had fraudulently inflated its profits by nearly $4 billion. The entire growth story that had made Bernie Ebbers a billionaire and WorldCom a Wall Street darling was built on fabricated numbers. When she presented her findings to the audit committee, the board had no choice. They fired Sullivan, they forced Ebbers to resign, and they called the SEC. WorldCom filed for bankruptcy in July 2002. It was the largest bankruptcy in American history at the time, a title it would hold until Lehman Brothers 6 years later. 17,000 employees lost their jobs. The stock, which had traded at $64 per share at its peak, became worthless. Pension funds lost billions. Mutual funds took catastrophic hits. Bernie Ebbers was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. He died there in 2020, still insisting he'd known nothing about the accounting fraud, a claim nobody believed. Scott Sullivan got 5 years after cooperating with prosecutors. But the real damage wasn't measured in prison sentences. It was measured in trust. WorldCom proved that a company could lie to regulators, auditors, and investors for years without anyone catching on. It proved that the systems designed to protect the public, accounting firms, regulatory agencies, independent boards, could be captured, corrupted, or simply fooled. The fraud was simple, the damage was catastrophic, and it was just the beginning. While WorldCom was cooking its books in Mississippi, another corporate fraud was unfolding in New York. But this one wasn't about fake profits. It was about old-fashioned theft dressed up as executive compensation. Tyco International was a massive conglomerate that made everything from security systems to medical supplies to underwater cables. By 2001, it employed over 250,000 people worldwide and generated nearly $40 billion in annual revenue. And at the top of this empire sat a man named Dennis Kozlowski, the CEO who would become the poster child for corporate greed. Kozlowski didn't hide his wealth. He flaunted it. He lived in a Manhattan penthouse. He owned estates in Florida and Connecticut. He threw parties that cost millions, including a now infamous 40th birthday bash for his wife on the island of Sardinia, complete with an ice sculpture of Michelangelo's David urinating vodka. The party cost $2 million. Half of it was billed to Tyco shareholders as a business expense. That was Dennis Kozlowski's genius. He didn't steal money and hide it. He stole it and called it compensation. He and his chief financial officer, Mark Schwartz, created a labyrinth of unauthorized bonuses, forgivable loans, and executive perks that let them drain Tyco like a personal piggy bank. They approved bonuses for themselves without board authorization. They forgave hundreds of millions in loans they'd given themselves. They used company funds to buy art, apartments, and luxury goods, then claimed it was all part of their executive packages. The scale was staggering. Between 1997 and 2002, Kozlowski and Schwartz looted roughly $600 million from Tyco, not through accounting fraud like WorldCom, through sheer brazen theft disguised as legitimate business practice. And they might have gotten away with it if Kozlowski hadn't gotten greedy in a particularly stupid way. In 2002, he was charged with evading over $1 million in sales tax on art purchases. Not corporate fraud, not securities violations, sales tax on paintings. The investigation into that relatively minor charge led prosecutors to look deeper into Kozlowski's finances, and what they found was astonishing. Tyco's board claimed they had no idea what Kozlowski was doing. Independent directors said they'd approved compensation packages but hadn't understood the details. Auditors from PricewaterhouseCoopers said everything looked fine on the surface. The same institutional safeguards that had failed at WorldCom failed at Tyco. Boards that didn't ask questions, auditors who took management's word, regulators who only investigated after the damage was done. Kozlowski and Schwartz were convicted in 2005 of grand larceny, securities fraud, and falsifying business records. They each received 8 to 25 years in prison. Kozlowski was released in 2014 after serving more than 6 years. Today he works for a small manufacturing company in New Jersey, earning a tiny fraction of what he once stole. But the message Tyco sent was more insidious than WorldCom's. WorldCom had faked profits to keep a dying company alive. Tyco's executives looted a profitable company simply because they could. They proved that corporate governance was a joke, that boards of directors were rubber stamps, that the systems designed to prevent executive theft were easily gamed by executives willing to push boundaries. The fraud wasn't complicated. It was just bold. And it worked for years because nobody wanted to question the CEO of a $40 billion company. Nobody wanted to be the board member who accused Dennis Kozlowski of stealing when his defenders would say he was just being compensated for success. Tyco didn't collapse like WorldCom. It survived, restructured, and eventually split into multiple companies. But the damage to corporate credibility was done. Two massive frauds in 2 years, one based on fake profits, one based on executive theft, proved that America's corporate elite was rotten. And Wall Street was about to learn the rot went deeper than anyone imagined. Houston, Texas, late 1990s. The energy industry was being deregulated, and a company called Enron was positioning itself to dominate the new frontier. They didn't just sell electricity and natural gas, they traded it like stocks, buying, selling, creating complex financial instruments that treated energy like a commodity to be speculated on. Wall Street loved it. Investors loved it. And for a brief, shining moment, Enron was the 7th largest company in America. The CEO was a man named Kenneth Lay, grandfatherly, religious, politically connected. The president was Jeffrey Skilling, Harvard MBA, McKinsey consultant, brilliant and ruthless. Together, they built a corporate culture that worshipped one thing above all else: the stock price. Enron's value wasn't measured in assets or revenue. It was measured in market perception. And Enron's executives became masters of perception management. They created something called mark-to-market accounting. It's a legitimate practice in some contexts, but Enron weaponized it. Here's how it worked. When Enron signed a long-term energy contract, they could book the entire projected profit immediately, even though the actual money wouldn't arrive for years. If Enron signed a 20-year deal to supply natural gas, they'd estimate the total profit and record it as revenue today. Never mind that the profit was theoretical. Never mind that the deal might fall apart or lose money. On paper, Enron looked wildly profitable. But the real genius, or evil, depending on your perspective, was how Enron hid its debt. They created thousands of subsidiary companies called special purpose entities. These were shell corporations designed to hold Enron's debt off the main balance sheet. Enron would transfer losing assets and liabilities to these subsidiaries, making the parent company look financially healthy while the rot accumulated in the shadows. The chief financial officer, Andrew Fastow, ran this shell game. He personally profited from managing the SPEs, a massive conflict of interest that should have set off alarms. But Enron's board approved it. Arthur Andersen, one of the world's most prestigious accounting firms, signed off on the books. Wall Street analysts gave Enron glowing reviews. Fortune magazine named Enron America's most innovative company 6 years in a row. Beneath the innovation was a company that produced almost nothing of real value. Enron's traders manipulated energy markets, creating artificial shortages to drive up prices, most notoriously during California's energy crisis in 2001, when rolling blackouts left millions without power, while Enron traders joked on recorded phone lines about stealing money from grandma. The entire edifice was sustained by one thing: the stock price. As long as Enron's market value kept rising, the company could borrow more money, hide more debt, and maintain the illusion of profitability. But the moment the stock started to fall, the whole structure would collapse like a house of cards. That moment came in October 2001. A Wall Street Journal reporter named Bethany McLean published an article asking a simple question: how does Enron make its money? She tried to understand Enron's financial statements and found them deliberately opaque. When she asked company officials to explain, they stonewalled her. The article raised enough red flags that investors started asking questions too. Enron's stock began to fall, and once it started, the descent was catastrophic. The SPEs that held all the hidden debt were legally required to maintain certain value thresholds. When Enron's stock fell, those thresholds were breached, forcing Enron to absorb billions in previously hidden liabilities onto its balance sheet. The company that had been worth $70 billion in market value was suddenly revealed to be drowning in debt. Enron filed for bankruptcy in December 2001. 20,000 employees lost their jobs. Most of them also lost their retirement savings, which had been heavily invested in Enron stock that company executives had encouraged them to buy, even as those same executives were secretly selling their own shares. The pension funds were wiped out. The stock became worthless. Kenneth Lay was convicted of fraud and conspiracy, but died of a heart attack before sentencing. Jeffrey Skilling got 24 years in prison, later reduced to 14. Andrew Fastow served 6 years after cooperating with prosecutors. Arthur Andersen, the accounting firm, was convicted of obstruction of justice and effectively dissolved, taking 28,000 jobs with it. But the real victim was trust. Enron proved that the entire financial system was built on sand. That auditors could be complicit, that regulators could be asleep, that analysts could be cheerleaders instead of watchdogs, that a company could lie to everyone, employees, investors, the public, for years, and nobody with the power to stop it would act until it was too late. WorldCom had faked profits. Tyco had looted the treasury. But Enron did something worse. They created an entire alternate reality, a complex, deliberate fiction that required thousands of people to either participate or look the other way. And it worked until it didn't. The seed had become a forest fire. The numbers are almost too big to process. WorldCom, $4 billion in fraudulent profits, 17,000 jobs lost. Tyco, $600 million stolen, reputation destroyed. Enron, $70 billion in market value evaporated, 20,000 jobs gone, pension funds obliterated. But focus on this instead. A 58-year-old engineer at Enron who'd worked there for 23 years. His entire retirement savings was in Enron stock. The company matched employee contributions with company shares, and executives assured employees the stock was rock solid. When Enron collapsed, his $400,000 retirement account became worth $11,000. He had 2 years until retirement. He ended up working as a night security guard until he was 73. A woman who'd spent 30 years at WorldCom. She'd started as a receptionist and worked her way up to regional manager. When the company went bankrupt, she lost her job and her pension. She was 54 years old. She applied to over 200 jobs before finally finding work at Target, earning a quarter of what she'd made at WorldCom. A factory worker whose pension fund was heavily invested in Tyco. He'd paid into that pension for 37 years. When the fund's Tyco holdings collapsed, his pension was cut by 40%. He'd been planning to retire at 65. Instead, he worked until he was 72 and died 6 months after retirement. He never got to take the fishing trip to Alaska he'd been saving for his whole life. These weren't wealthy investors or hedge fund managers. They were ordinary people who did everything right. They worked hard. They saved. They trusted the institutions that were supposed to protect them. And they were destroyed by executives who treated corporations like personal ATMs and accounting firms that enabled the theft. The WorldCom, Tyco, and Enron scandals triggered a legislative response. Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in 2002, imposing stricter accounting standards and criminal penalties for corporate fraud. CEOs now had to personally certify the accuracy of financial statements. Auditors faced tougher independence requirements. Boards were forced to implement stronger oversight. It didn't matter. Because the problem wasn't rules. The problem was incentives. As long as executives were compensated based on stock prices, they would manipulate stock prices. As long as boards were stocked with CEOs' friends, they would rubber stamp whatever management wanted. As long as accounting firms were paid by the companies they audited, they would look the other way. The institutions had failed. And 6 years later, when the financial system nearly collapsed entirely, it would become clear that nobody had learned a thing. Day 1 was about individuals who lied. Day 2 was about institutions that lied. The scale increased, the complexity increased, but the core mechanism remained identical. Promise something you can't deliver, hide the truth as long as possible, and hope you can cash out before the collapse. Ponzi promised returns he couldn't generate. WorldCom promised profits it wasn't making. Stanford sold exclusivity. Tyco's executives sold competence while looting the company. Madoff sold certainty. Enron sold innovation while creating nothing but smoke and mirrors. 6 scams, 6 different approaches. One truth: The fraud works because we want it to work. We want to believe the returns are real. We want to believe the CEO is a genius. We want to believe the system has safeguards that prevent catastrophic failure. And when those beliefs are proven false, when the institutions we trusted are revealed to be either complicit or incompetent, we don't abandon the system. We patch it. We pass new laws. We promise it won't happen again. And then it happens again. Bigger, faster, more devastating. Tomorrow, the scams evolve one more time. From individuals to institutions to something more insidious. Industries that lie as a business model. Where the fraud isn't hidden, it's the product. Where millions of people are complicit without knowing they're part of the con. Where the victim and the accomplice are the same person.